we were looking at the reduction factors that allow for the risk of periods of non-employment, and we were just discussing the relevance of being employed or not employed and being disabled or not disabled, and the reasons they were included here. What we have on the screen is page 9 of the document we were looking at before the break, Table A and Table B in relation to males, Table A not disabled, Table B disabled, and we see that there are columns under employed and columns under non-employed, and then levels 1, level 2, level 3 under each of those separate headings and determined by age at trial. Before we dig into those factors, can we just turn back to page 4 so that we can see the definitions that are used to decide whether someone is employed or not employed, disabled, not disabled, and what those levels 1, 2 and 3 mean. So we see here definition of employed. Employed, in respect of tables A and C, those who were employed, self-employed or on a government training scheme as at the time of injury. Tables B and D are the same, but as at the date of assessment or trial. Not employed, all others, including those temporarily out of work, full-time students and unpaid family workers. Then in terms of the definition of disability, for the purposes of these tables, it's important to note that the definition of disability used in the Ogden tables, these tables we're looking at, is not the same as that used in the Equality Act 2010. The Ogden definition of disability is based on the definition of disability set out in the Disability Discrimination Act 1995, supported by the accompanying guidance notes. This is because this is the definition that applied at the time of the underlying labour force survey research, which underpins the suggested Table A to D reduction factors. In addition to meeting the Disability Discrimination Act 1995 definition of disability, the impairment must also be work affecting by either limiting the kind or amount of work the claimant is able to do. The Ogden definition of disability is defined as follows. Disabled person. A person is classified as being disabled if all 3 of the following conditions in relation to ill health or disability are met. The person has an illness or a disability which has or is expected to last for over a year or is a progressive illness. And the 1995 definition is satisfied in that the impact of the disability has a substantial adverse effect on the person's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities, and the effects of impairment limit either the kind or the amount of paid work he or she can do. And then not disabled, all others. Then if we turn the page, we see the definition of highest educational qualification, just at the bottom of the page. Highest educational qualification is used here as a proxy for human capital stroke skill level, so that those in professional occupations such as law, accountancy, nursing, etc., who do not have a degree ought to be treated as if they do have one. 3 levels of educational attainment are defined for the purposes of tables A to D as follows. Level 3, higher degree, degree or equivalent, higher education qualification below degree level. Level 2, A-level or equivalent, at least 1 at pass level E. GCSE or equivalent, at least 1 pass at pass level A star to C, or 9 to 4 in the new language of GCSEs. Level 1, low-level qualifications below GCSE, no qualifications and other qualifications. And so then if we turn back to page 9, those definitions are used to work out which reduction factor should apply. So, Mr. Carter, is this right? One then chooses the factor and multiplies the multiplier by that number, so it will reduce the actuarial number to a greater or lesser extent, depending on employment status and disability status.
Yes, the short answer is yes, but it's a very complicated exercise and question, I think.
So, looking at the table, if a male is aged 20 to 24, in table A, employed at the time not disabled, but with a level 3 qualification, there would be quite a limited adjustment because you'd only be multiplying it by 0.91, which is close to 1.
Correct. So it would be reduced for life expectancy slightly, and then this table would reduce it slightly more.
These are generalised across all jobs, of course. So if you were looking at somebody, speaking to someone who let us suppose, worked in a job where there was considerable job insecurity, to be taking some of the high flyer who works for an American company. American companies often been known for a hire and fire mentality, as recent, perhaps, I don't know if the recent Twitter loss of jobs is an example. If one works in that sort of environment, you would need to make a special adjustment, would you? Or would you need to modify your, or to use this as a base, but take that into account?
Yes, you would. I should say these figures, my figures as an employment expert, are fed into these figures, and then you lawyers do something with these figures. But I would say exactly what you said. Yes, you could do this, but then one has to look at the occupational area and decide whether to make further adjustments or not.
I mean, some jobs are comparatively secure. Other jobs aren't, particularly given the definition of earnings here. It covers an awful lot of casual, so-called casual work, which is the only work which a lot of people have. If you take an Uber driver, for instance, then or somebody who's in non-guaranteed hours contracts are known as the official description of 0 hours contracts. Then they may have work, they may not, and it may be insecure.
Well, again, that's true. If one worked for the local authority, I mean, it used to always be the case, the job for life. So this may apply.
But it depends how you work for the local authority. If you're in a contractor,
that's true.
Employed on a contracting out, then you might be in exactly the 0 hours position.
True. But if you were, and an increasing number are on 0 hours contracts or fixed term contracts, then this wouldn't apply.
I mean, the current position in the labour market is roughly 81% of those employed are employed in the service industry in this country, as I understand the latest ONS figures.
It sounds about right.
And service industries are notoriously dependent upon demand for the service.
Correct.
So it all depends what particular service, retail, entertainment, or other services which are more robust, perhaps.
It would. In fact, well, you could see we've only got 3 categories. In fact, we should say that the employment, the education levels, they go through and they widen it out further in the facts and figures. But you've only got some figures here to apply blanketly across, as you're saying, any employment, any occupational area. You've got the age factor and you've got the employment factor. But the bits that's missing you've got the age factor and you've got the disability factor. But the factor that's missing is the employment factor.
But your point is that although these are reductions, there is a need to look on the other side as well, which is the promotions that might take place, the better job opportunities which may come along, the headhunting which may exist.
Absolutely, and in fact these are discount factors. You need another table on the screen here to add plus factors, and they're the ones. They're actually the ones you're saying there.
Yes. Thank you.
And might another plus factor be that if somebody is working for an employer who is known and has evidence that they are particularly good about doing reasonable adjustments and keeping people in work, might that be a further plus factor?
Well, the easy answer is yes, but the issue is reasonable adjustments and reasonable. It's not always possible to modify the work to meet a disability.
Drawing that all together, I'm asked to ask you what you see as the advantages and disadvantages of an individualised assessment of loss of earnings. So looking at each individual separately.
Well, that would be ideal. Of course, one could then factor in all the things we've been talking about: the education, the family education, the work history, and both the but-for career scenario and the but-with scenario. One can take into account the effect of the disability. Whether that's possible, and I think it could be possible with a matrix. It would be ideal to have each individual and an assessment made, but with enough material, one could, I think, make some assessment, but ideally it would be on a case-by-case basis.
Another form of award I'm asked to explore with you is what's called a Blamire Award, and that's when the court doesn't use a detailed calculation, when there's no real alternative, there's insufficient evidence and there are too many imponderables for that calculation basis, and instead a broad brush lump sum is awarded by the court. From your perspective as an employment expert, what sort of situations would you be aware of when it's too difficult to come up with an annual earnings figure, or are they rare from your perspective?
I think that the terminology I had was Smith and Manchester, I think, but that's probably an earlier case, Mr. Smith and Manchester, or is that not correct?
It's a slightly different form of award. A Smith and Manchester award is when there's a contingent future risk that a claimant will find themselves on the open labour market, and it will take longer for them to get the job.
I think it's an actual risk, isn't it? Because if Smith and Manchester awards, they're for loss of earning capacity. If someone is injured, they've lost their earning capacity if the injury has any long-term effects at all.
Thank you, sir.
And to the extent that that actually affects earnings, there is room for an additional award to recognise that. I think Mr. Snowden behind you is nodding.
He is. I was waiting for a further question from someone else behind me. Thank you, sir, for correcting me. So it's a slightly different award to a Blamire. A Blamire is where there's too many imponderables. You can't do the annual times the multiplier with all your clever discount factors, so you come to a broad brush lump sum.
Oh.
And so what I'm asking is, in your experience, what sort of situations, if any, is it too difficult to come up with an annual earnings figure?
Perhaps I'd answer it in two answers, perhaps. We're usually instructed to assist the court in cases where perhaps you can't use the Ogden tables because you don't have a pre-injury definite figure. You don't have a post-injury definite figure. You have to analyse the individual, look at the market, and then offer the court an indication as to but for and but with. The other cases where there's too much imponderables, that's a bit like, look, nobody knows, we can't give you an award. I don't think that's right. Just because it's difficult doesn't mean you can't analyse it. So I think you can actually. Somebody will have employment. There will be imponderables, but one can factor those into an assessment as to a possible career trajectory, or maybe having to do one or two career trajectories.
We can take that document down now, thank you. Turning now to those who are affected rather than infected. So affected family members and spouses and children, and that broader picture. What's the impact of an imposed career break for caring reasons on someone's career trajectory, generally?
Well, I don't think there can be a generally answer. If you're a lorry driver, let's say, and you take a career break, then you can go back to be a lorry driver. If you're a nurse and take a career break, then you have to do a refresher of course. If you're a lawyer, you've got to keep up with your professional development points. So there's different answers there. In some cases, some employment, then a career break won't have such an impact. On other careers, there will be an impact. But then there's another question to that, is how will it affect your career trajectory? And that's perhaps more important, in that if you're on a career trajectory, let's take a nurse again, and you're a grade 6, you take a career break, come back, you probably have to come back at a grade 4, and whether you can again achieve a grade 6 may be more difficult. So breaking a career trajectory is really important. An employer, an interview panel, will expect to see a particular step or steps in a career. You often hear lost the window of opportunity. And that is a real factor. One could look at it at women returners and what's put in place to assist women returners. So there's keep in touch days, there's staged return to work, but there is a significant effect on someone's career if it's broken. It's not what an employer, well, what happened here? Why weren't they working? Is likely to run through an employer's mind, pushing that application to the bottom of the pile rather than the top of the pile.
And is there a qualitative difference in a career break for caring reasons where the timing hasn't been chosen as compared to many women who might have some choice over when they take a career break, for example, for family reasons?
Yes.
And what would that impact? How do we assess that impact, that difference?
Assessing it is different. You're right that there is a difference. You take maternity leave, you say, I'll be coming back. Fine. You're applying for a job. Why didn't you work? Oh, I was looking after the children. If you've got a fracture in your career and you're looking to explain what it was, why was it? Well, I was disabled, or I had a disability, or I was caring for someone with a disability. It's much harder to then rejoin the labour market.
Are you aware of any data that's available that addresses those kind of issues?
No.
And are you aware of any research that deals with how orphans or those who've lost a parent fare on the labour market as compared to those who've not lost a parent or parents?
Well, there is some information on that. Although it's difficult. In fact, I've been doing a lot of work recently on historic abuse cases and the children put into care. And so there's some information with regard to outcome for those, but they use the word cared for. So we don't really know whether they're in care, in good care, or good enough care. But what we do know is you're less likely to go to university. You're actually more likely to go to college. If you do go to university, you're more likely not to finish university. So the information that we have, although that I'm aware of, although there are difficulties with it, that the English study used the term disadvantaged children, those who had free school meals, for example. But what we do have is if you come from care, then you'll do less well academically, which has a knock-on effect for your employment and career.
But those studies are focused on children who are then looked after children. So are you aware of any research where there's...
No.
No, where somebody is able to stay in the family unit, but that one parent is lost?
No, I'm not aware of any studies. That's the closest, but it's not a proper match.
You mentioned earlier in your evidence the question of whether a matrix could be established to assess loss of earnings by grouping people according to particular factors. If a model like that were to be considered, what factors would ideally be included to create those groupings? Well,
in fact, in my evidence, it wasn't my best case scenario. The best case scenario is look at each case individually. If one had to try and find a matrix, then one would need to factor into it. The three main key factors would be education, would be employment, would be age, well actually there's more categories, would be geographical area.
And can you just unpack, we've talked about all three apart from the geographical area. Could you unpack that for us, please?
Okay, you need to know qualification, which we have there. We need to break it down a little bit more in not academic qualifications, but a broader aspect. And in fact, change the title from qualification to certification. So you might be a coded welder, but you have no qualifications at all. If you're a coded welder, then you are highly regarded as a welder, so your employability is greater. So you need information with regard to education, but in its broadest sense of certification as well as qualifications.
So I think we were at cross purposes. What I was asking you to unpack was the geographical area. What you meant by that?
Okay, on the one I can work backwards. There will be certain areas that have higher unemployment. So London, for example, has greater employment than certain areas in the northeast.
So those are the questions I have for Mr. Carter. We obviously need a break for me to ascertain whether there are any further questions from the recognised legal representatives.
Yes, let me just explain to Mr. Carter. Those who are core participants represented by lawyers in the inquiry, they have different interests in the inquiry, have a right to put questions to you through counsel. Plainly, a lot of those questions may have been answered in what you've said, and so they won't necessarily have been formulated yet for counsel to ask, and others may arise from what you have said, which had not been anticipated before. So counsel must be given an opportunity to field those questions and then put them to you. How long do you think you might need?
I anticipate needing about 20 minutes to make sure that those behind me can also take instructions.
Yes, well, let's then say, shall we, not before 5 to 12, not before because it may take a bit longer, but we won't come back anyway before 5 to 12, and I can't tell you how long after you come back you'll be detained.
Thank you.